Hey everyone, welcome. In this video we're going to look at handling many-to-many relationships using Prisma 2, the new version of Prisma. If you're not familiar with Prisma, it's self-described as a next-generation ORM for Node.js and TypeScript. So if you're building a TypeScript project, then this might just be the tool for you. Right? If you've used TypeScript with, say, Sequelize, then you know that it's not easy to integrate TypeScript with a Sequelize project. But with Prisma, they do a lot of the work for you, and you'll find you won't run into too many type errors in your initial setup. Basically, for this project or for this example, we want to look at something like this, where we're building maybe a project management tool, and it has a bunch of users who can sign up for the service, and each user can be attached to a bunch of projects. Excuse me. So we can set up a list of users and also all of the projects they're attached to, in the database. And then also we could find a bunch of projects, look up a bunch of projects, and then for each of the projects we can see the members that are attached to it. Right, but in the database we won't actually be adding these fields. We're going to use a relationship table or a junction table to get this information and to set this information up. So if you go to the Prisma documentation, they have a tutorial called Start from Scratch. And they tell you to go ahead and create a folder, initialize it, add as dev dependencies Prisma, TypeScript, TS Node, and @types Node because you're using TypeScript with Node. They give you some code for your tsconfig.json file. This is what I'm using. And then they introduce the Prisma client. Right, or the Prisma CLI, excuse me. And you can use that to initialize a Prisma project. And if you do that, then you'll see once you initialize it, you run that command, you get a folder called Prisma with a file called schema.prisma. And then you also get a .env file where you can set up your connection string. I'm using a Postgres database for this project, so you can use whatever database you like. But for now, if you're going to follow along, go ahead and pause the video, set that up, and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so hopefully you've got your database set up and your connection established using your connection string. All right, so now we'll want to fill in our schema, right? And this schema is all we need to fill in to create our tables in our database, right? We'll run a migration, it'll create the tables in the database, and we'll be up and running. So they give you a sample schema in the docs, right? That Start from Scratch tutorial. But this only looks at a one-to-many relationship between posts and users. So I found this page here that has an example of a many-to-many relationship, and they give you a nice little schema to get started with. And I'll include the link to this page in the description below the video. So if you have that, grab this bit of code here and then paste it into your schema. So here they've set up a many-to-many relationship between posts, like a blog post, and its tags, right? So you can have many posts in the blog, and each post can have many tags, and then each tag can be assigned to many posts. So there's your many-to-many relationship. But for our little example, we're going to call this project, this model. All right, and they're going to call this one here user. And the relationship table model is going to be project user. And by the way, like in Sequelize, if you give the model this singular name, like project, the table name would end up being projects. It'll be pluralized, but Prisma doesn't do that for you, so be aware of that. Okay, so each project will have an ID. That will be the primary key, and that's what this add ID means. All right, it'll be an integer, auto-incrementing. Each project will have a title, right, which will be a string. And to show that type, you can use @db.varchar 255 if you like. Right, we'll need also for a project a status, That'll also be at db. Sorry, not thinking right here. At db.varchar 255. Now, for the project, you would think you would have a list of users, right? Because that's what we wanted. That's what we set up in our basic schema, right? If you go back here, you can see that each project would have a list of users, which I've called members here. And we can actually call them members here. And it should be pluralized, right? Because it's going to be a list. Again, it needs to look exactly like this. All right, but instead of using, I mean, you would think intuitively, if it's a list of members, then right here, this would be, sorry about that, I had to cough, hit the cough button. That would be a list of users, right? I mean, intuitively, that's what you would think. But actually, we would use the relationship table model, right? And that's something that seems unique to Prisma, or at least in my experience it is. So here, you would use project user. Right? And then down for user, you would have an ID. I don't want to use integer, I want to use a UUID, so it would be string. Let's go ahead and space things out. Right, and being a string, it wouldn't be auto-incrementing, but it would be, so you do your @db thing, and then you can get UUID. The auto completion is really, really nice in Prisma. All right, so the name would be a string. It's not unique, so I use @id dot, sorry, not id, db dot varchar 255. We need an email string. Now this would be unique, so you use the @unique bit here, and what this will do is this will tell Postgres to set up a unique field, so that if someone with an email that's already being used tries to create a new account and enter those values into the database using an email that's already used, it won't let it happen, right? It'll throw an error. It's like a unique constraint violation. Again, db dot varchar 255. And we'll need a password. It's also a string, db.varchar. And we won't want a list of posts. So again, sorry if it seems like I'm beating a dead horse here, but we'll need a list of projects. So that's what we change this to. And then we'll use our relationship model, which is project user. All right, now what we need to do is handle our project user model, our relationship table model here. All right, so the ID can be an auto-incrementing integer, that's fine. Now here's our foreign key relation set up right here. So we're not looking at post ID, but we're looking at a project ID. We're going to use an existing project ID, right? And that's going to be our foreign key, and it references the ID in the projects table. So again, let's space things out here. All right, but not post, project. Okay, so that's the foreign key relation between, or for project ID between this project user and the project. And now we can set up one for the user. So this would be user here. This wouldn't be tag, but user. And then the field would be user ID. Now we're getting errors here, and you can see right here it says it has to refer to existing fields, right? So we haven't defined project ID, so we can do that here. But the error won't go away, right? Because here it says that field is optional, right? But we haven't set it to be optional, so we have to get rid of that. That error goes away. Now for user, this should be user ID, right? And this shouldn't be int. Remember, we're using a UUID, so it should be string. All right, but the error is still there. We can even take away this non-optional thing, or we can make it not optional. We still have the error, and that's because that it says here this user ID isn't referencing, it isn't matching the type of the referenced field ID in the model user. That's this one here, or basically here. So if we add this, we'll be okay. So if you just copy that, that makes that error go away. Okay, one last thing here is we want to set up a composite primary key, right? Which means that we'll have two different fields that make up a primary key. So that way, if we have values from those two fields which are already used together in another project assignment, and that's what project user represents. It represents a bunch of assignments of users to projects or projects to users. So if we have two assignments and both of those have the same user and the same user ID and same project ID, that would mean that we've assigned a user to the same project twice. We don't want to do that, so we make up a composite primary key using both of these field values, project ID and user ID. I know that's a lot of words and it's probably not easy to figure out, but if you worked with composite primary keys before, I think you know what I'm saying. So we don't want the ID to be the primary key. We want to make a composite primary key down here. We can say at, and we've got to use the double at, right? Double at ID, and we add the two fields, project ID and user ID. Okay, so there's our composite primary key. So our schema looks good, and this is all we need to set up now to create our tables in our database. All right, so all we need to do now is run a migration. And to do that, if you go to the documentation, the start from scratch tutorial, right, they say just do a migration by running this, right? So we're using the Prisma CLI. All right, and you can give it whatever name you like. We're just going to use init for initialize. All right, so you can see all right, somehow it didn't let me keep that code. Let me go back and grab that. Oh, there it is. Okay, good. Sorry, it just jumped me away from the screen. Hold on a sec here. Okay, so if we run our migration, right, it takes a little bit of time. It generates a Prisma client. And Prisma client basically is going to allow us to make our queries, right? It's like if you use Sequelize, you would do, sequelize.model.create, for example. And that's what Prisma client does for us. So it's basically the equivalent of Sequelize, but it's a lot more powerful. All right, so if you take a look at your database now, refresh. You've got some tables. You've got a user table, right, which has all of the required fields, right? ID is a primary key, UUID, name, email, password. You've got a project table, right? ID is an auto-incrementing integer, that's the primary key, title and status. And then you've got this relationship table, project user, which should have just the project ID and user ID, right, as inputs. And then just a regular table ID. Right, so here's your table ID, but it's not the primary key. Our project ID and user ID work together as a composite primary key. All right, so just by writing this simple schema, we were able to do that. All right, so it's a lot less work than Sequelize. And I don't mean to keep comparing it to Sequelize, and I'm not bashing on Sequelize because it's a great tool and I love it, but I think that I'm finding that Prisma is going to be the go-to tool in the future, at least for me. All right, so now what we'll do is we'll add some data to the database, add some records. So I've created this file here, right, and you can add data in your own way. Maybe pause the video and create your own file. It looks something like this. All right, I've got a list of users, a list of projects, and a list of assignments. So the first thing we'll do is add some users. All right, so in the root of our project, you can create a file, index.ts. All right, and we can get, actually I've already got it in here. I was supposed to erase it. So that's what I'll do now. All right, and if you go to the documentation, they give you a little skeleton for that index.ts file. Right here under write your first query with Prisma client. Let's just copy that. All right, we'll want to import our users list. All right, and we've got our users. So now we can use the Prisma client and the function create many. All right, so it automatically auto-completes down to user. It probably sensed that we wanted to use user because that's our model. We have only 3 models, so it just probably figured user was the most likely one used. I'm not sure how it inferred that, but that's one thing about Prisma. It has great auto-completion. All right, so create many, and what you'll do is you'll open up a set of curly braces, and the field that you have to add here that's different from, say, Sequelize is a field called data, and then you can add the users list. Right, and if you're unclear about that, you can look at the documentation. Right, they show you an example of a create for a single record, a create query, and you can see that they use that first data field here. All right, then we'll want to check our data to make sure it's in the database. So do that by running a query, prisma.user.findMany. And then we can log it to the console. All right, so let's go ahead and run npx ts node index.ts. All right, so we were able to add the records for 2 users. One is Bob and one is Jane. All right, and just as a check, we can go look at our database. We can look at the users table, and we see we've got those 2 records. All right, so now we'll want to bring in this list of projects and add these two to the database. So we can import them. Can change our model to, if we just type in P, it should autocomplete project, right? Type in R, made me a liar. Finally, had to type in PRO, we finally get project, that comes up, so we know that's available through Prisma client. Right, we're going to use the same function, create many, but now our input data is projects. We can just change this around a little bit. Project came up right away on that one. Good, so let's run that. So it looks like those are added to the database as well, just these two projects right here. All right, and then finally let's add some assignments. But for assignments, we need to assign an existing user to an existing project, right? So we need that information. If you look at your database and you look at your projects table, right, we used auto-incrementing integers, so just 1 and 2. So we have project ID 1, project ID 2. So those are easy to remember. Unfortunately, the IDs, because they're UUIDs for the users, are not easy to remember. So you'll have to go ahead and copy the UUID, say for Bob. Right, and then in your assignments list, go ahead and add in that UUID, Bob's ID. For project 1 and project 2, we want to assign him to both projects. And then we'll assign Jane also to project 1 to work with Bob. So go back to your data, your projects table. Right, and for Jane, can copy, and we'll paste that in. Okay, and then in our index.ts file, bring in assignments. So this model was project user, right? And Prisma camel cases everything, so it won't be capital P, capital U like here. It'll be lowercase p and then capital U. So beware of that, or be aware of that. So we should be able to type in a big U and see through autocomplete that model. We get it right away. So again, this is assignments. Gotta love the autocomplete in Prisma. All right, so let's run that. Okay, so we've added those assignments to the database. So let's look at a query now. So going back and looking at our original schema, not our Prisma schema, but the one we had before we even set up our project. All right, we wanted for a user, if we looked up a user, we would like to see all of this information, maybe minus the password. We wouldn't want to reveal that. And we'd like to see a list of projects, right? Of course, in the database, there isn't a column of projects where for each user you can find that list, right? We have to get it through the relationship table, project user. Right, but that's pretty easy to do with Prisma. It's done very cleanly. You don't have to do a lot of filtering or writing of loops to parse the data in the way that you need it. So let's take a look at the documentation for modeling and querying many-to-many relationships. You can see they give you a find many query here with the include function, right, or the include field. And that's just like in Sequelize, you have that as well. So copy that. Go ahead and comment this bit out here. Paste it in right here. All right, so the model is user. All right, what we want to include are the projects. All right, and we want to include for all the projects each project. All right, but what's going to happen is, because we're relating the projects to the user through that intermediary table, that project user table, we're going to get all of that project user information as well. So our response to our query is going to be quite verbose. Let's take a look at it. All right, so if we run our query, that's a big ugly response, right? So say for the first user, Bob, right, you had the ID, name, email, password, which we really don't want to, we want to make sure we don't send that any further than this. You also have a list of projects, and in that list of projects you've got the project ID again, the user ID, right, which we already got here, so the user ID again. Then we finally get down to the project information, and again you get the project ID. Really, probably all we wanted was the title and maybe the status. All right, so we can get rid of all this extra information, right, just by using a simple for loop, and they are kind enough at Prisma docs to give us one. So if we go back to the documentation, right, and grab this little for loop here, so now we're going to map over that initial response, which is all users, and then for each user, we'll get the user, and then we'll get the project's information. Right, and then for that list of projects, we're going to map over it. Sorry, let me go back here. Sorry, I confused myself a little bit there. In this case, post was user. User projects. Then we're going to map over all the projects for that user, and then for each project, right, project.project. Now I know this looks weird, right, but it's because we're trying to eliminate all of the project user information, right? We just want the information from the project table, not the project user table. All right, and it should be good. So if we run it now, we still got all of that. Well, it would help if I returned the right, or tried to log the right response to the console. This should be a result. All right, so one more time, we should get a nice streamlined response. And there it is, right? So for each user, we only get the user ID, the username, the user email, the password, and for the projects, we only get the project ID, the project title, and its status, right? We don't get all that other information from the project user table. Anyway, minus a few brain farts on my part, I think we got through that fairly smoothly. And I hope that this shows you the power of Prisma, right? It's easy to get set up. You just write a simple schema, do a migration, it creates your tables, and then you can write these very powerful queries which give you a very customized response, I think. And we haven't really even touched at all what you can do with a really well-defined query in Prisma. So that's it. I hope you're encouraged to use Prisma maybe in a project in the near future. And if you do and you find it works out well for you, let me know in the comments below the video. Or if you have troubles, let me know that too. Anyway, thanks as always for joining me, and I'll see you next time.